Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is World Watchers, a one-hour news program. It's program number 776, October the 20th, 1986. I'm going to continue with part 2 of the Daniloff story, Nicholas Daniloff, because I know it is very, very important. His role as a Tsarist white Russian, his location in Argentina, the years he was there, his period at Harvard University, with their very strongly anti-Soviet programs across the board, and I'll cite a few of them, and the role he played with disinformation, with trying to get, when Mark Lane was trying to get the investigation of the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King opened up again, that gray area that William Colby used, I referred to last week, with implanting a name of Richard Feldman and quoting him to get into the congressional record, the non-existent Richard Feldman, a la UPI news service. There is so much news going on that I don't like to put it aside, but this isn't putting it aside. This is very, very important to understand people like Nicholas Daniloff, how the emergency to get him home, how Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, was forced to meet Mr. Gorbachev on such short notice. The smugness of this person, the support of the State Department, all journalists around the world identifying and coming in. They had to get him home. They absolutely couldn't have him break down or talk in a Soviet jail. If he was innocent, there just couldn't be that much clamor and acclaim, or even the threat of breaking off arms talks and so forth. He was very, very important. And furthermore, he does link to an area that I suspect is possibly the only one that would cause the commotion it did. And that would be if the Soviet Union knew in any way, shape, or form, and has figured out by now and has fired people and charged them with crimes, people who allowed the Chernobyl nuclear disaster to happen, and the political effect it has had on the Soviet Union that will never wash away, because now we can blame hundreds or thousands or many thousands of cancers on the evil empire. As I said last week, when the broadcast was over, I was quoting a New York Times article. It was September the 9th, 1986, on the background of Daniloff, titled Nicholas Daniloff, the Bolsheviks' Prisoner. And it goes into his friends in the Soviet Union, that he liked theater and music, and he also developed a fascination with the Russian space exploits and wrote a book about them. As I said before, and I haven't been able to locate the book on the Soviet space exploits. Who did he interview in the Soviet Union under the guise of writing a book? Priscilla Johnson went on and wrote a book, Marina and Lee, and wrote the script of how Lee Oswald was supposed to have treated Marina Oswald, a journalist who wrote a book that turned history around, or she thought she could, and her husband wrote a book on Martin Luther King's assassination. Incidentally, it was at the home of Macmillan and her father that Svetlana Stalin was taken. When she was taken out of the Soviet Union by the CIA, she stayed at the home of the Macmillans. So they were involved in that process of bringing Svetlana as part of the Cold War, of lying about Lee and Marina Oswald's role, and lying about James Earl Ray in the murder of Martin Luther King. And Mr. Daniloff was lying about quoting a person who was non-existent, who was trying to place the blame on people wanting to open up the assassination investigation of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He interjects himself into that in spite of the fact, or because of his work also as a journalist in Russia. And interestingly enough, as I say, he wrote about the space program. Now, the space program has to include rockets, rocket factories, atomic plants. Now, someone inside the Soviet Union, as I say, a Galen agent, somebody worked for Wernher von Braun, the very people that made the space rockets for Germany, a good percentage, as I said before, talking about Chernobyl, went to live in Russia and planned for a long, long time, of course, the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And I believed that the Chernobyl effect was done by those people who could sabotage that incident. Now, the head of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, wasn't told for several days, and articles, maybe several hundred I've read in the course of that time period since Chernobyl, accused the Soviet Union of being a closed society where they keep secrets from their own. And how can you trust them when they don't tell their own about Gorbachev? But they always ignore the fact that Mr. Gorbachev wasn't told himself. And you can't force people to tell you something until they're ready to tell you. And if you hold it back 2 days, then you make him look like a clown that never could be trusted. And then the U.S. Information Agency, which is the CIA and State Department, got on the radio and told the Ukraine that you've been nuked, that all this nuclear waste is coming at you. And they waited until the radiation was picked up by other countries, Sweden, and so forth, and then said, look, we know, you're the last to know. And then the credibility of the leaders, as I say, was destroyed. And the only possible way to turn this around for the Soviet Union is to show Ronald Reagan that they understand the process by which we use propaganda, such as the Korean airline and so forth. And you see in the news this week the stories of disinformation and lies about deniability about George Bush and the CIA funding the Contras, when everybody has read for the past 6 years the involvement of the CIA and the Knights of Malta and the Vatican and the private organizations that are directly linked to the National Security Agency, to the Defense Department, the CIA, and George Bush allegedly got Mr. Gomez a job in El Salvador, and then they fly the planes from there. If the former director of the CIA does those things, he's involved in those things when he gets jobs for people within the agency who then say, I don't know anyone in the agency. So with a quick summit that was called this last week by Mr. Gorbachev, he said, come on, Ronnie, let's meet in Iceland. And they met. And Daniloff was never known for a lot of acquaintances, but he knew some well, and one described in the New York Times as Raoul Sagedev, Sagedvyev, Raoul, R-A-R-O-A-L-D, Sagedev. He's the head of the Space Research Institute, and Daniloff was working with him at the Space Research Institute. Well, were any of those the old Punamunda boys or the sons of the Punamunda? Here's Daniloff, who's the son of a man whose father was a spy for the Tsar, an intelligence grandfather, part of an assassination team to kill the Tsar. Who knows who runs the Space Research Institute? I'm sure that Mr. Gorbachev can find out or knows by now. And the article goes on, many of Daniloff's friends were willing to call on the presumably bugged apartment telephone, denouncing the KGB in strong terms. His apartment that radiates out of central Moscow is one of the few buildings not guarded around the clock by Soviet police because the phones are bugged. Well, if they're bugged, I'm sure that the KGB, if there was any link of Daniloff to anything like Chernobyl, and they were going to leak this at his trial, his leaks with the space people, imagine the shock it would have to the Western world, and imagine the way Ronald Reagan had to meet Mr. Gorbachev last week, considering all this that was happening. Now, this article goes on, the State Department couldn't have picked a worse person in terms of his well-known and favorably known personality as Mr. Daniloff throughout Washington, the press corps, and the State Department. This is a quotation of Frank Sieverts, Special Assistant for Public Affairs of the State Department Bureau for Refugee Programs. And, of course, refugees are the nucleus of the anti-Russian Cold War, hot war articles and organizations and protests, and the Jewish refugees and the protest groups. Now, it's interesting that the Special Assistant for Public Affairs, State Department Bureau for Refugee Programs is Frank Sieverts. This man's position is in 1985. He just happened to be a classmate of Nicholas Daniloff at Oxford before Daniloff picked up the UPI credentials to go to Moscow at a time in 1961 after the Gary Powers trial, when Oswald's in Minsk and Priscilla Johnson's coming home and Marina's going to come to the United States. Frank Sieverts is talking about how prominent Nicholas Daniloff is in the State Department, with the press corps throughout Washington, D.C., and the man who says it happens to be his roommate. Now, you go from Paris to Argentina, you go to Argentina to Harvard, then to London, Oxford, and then you work for an interim in the State Department and with the Defense Department and the White House, and Mr. Sieverts, the Special Assistant for Public Affairs there for refugees, just happens to be the roommate of Daniloff at Oxford at the same time. That's always interesting, just a classmate rather. So the question, did Mr. Sieverts take that Harvard refugee, Mr. Daniloff, in to Oxford, where they both handpicked to work for the State Department after 1965, for the Defense Department, for the White House? Obviously, they meet up again with very important positions that have to do with anti-Soviet anger and propaganda. Now, in 1983, on the 20th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination I mentioned last week, I wrote that article for Larry Flynt when he started the magazine Rebel on the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. Now, the questions I brought up in that article, and it's about 2 years, I've never had a response from a single Kennedy researcher in the United States that either said, May, that's wrong, or where did you get it, or you're off the wall, or let's pursue it. And they don't pursue these things, and they look at them with arm's distance. Either they're too lazy to do the work, or they're too dumb to understand it. Some are obviously agents that I'm not supposed to be knowing these things that I figured out. Some people are just too ignorant to understand what it is I'm saying. There's a lot of researchers that still, 2 years later, don't understand what I was saying. Now, I just want to repeat some sentences from what I published. People say, why don't you write a book? And I say, you don't understand the articles I've written. If you read all of those, then I'll write a book for you. But people don't understand them. Now, among other things in this article, I was talking about Lee Oswald's connections to DISC, the Defense Industry Security Command, and I mentioned that when he applied for a tourist card to enter Mexico in New Orleans in September 1963, he was with 4 other persons, and they had consecutive tourist numbers. They departed 9 days later than Oswald. They all arrived at the same time. They entered from different cities. They were part of that white Russian Solidarist Galen emigre community that Lee and Marina mingled with. And again, when he got his passport in New Orleans in 1963, he was ready to take another trip. Without his wife, he wanted a separate passport. He had a wife and 2 children, and he applied for a passport to leave the country that he would have in his pocket. He must have known something was going to cook up because he was actually a good family man. But agents don't have that choice. They have to travel. And then after he got the passport, he was with these white Russian czars when he went to Mexico. And in that same article, I was bringing up links of the CIA to the Kennedy assassination. And again, these go back to that time period with Daniloff in Moscow, titled John Tower, Senator John Tower and Marina Oswald. One of the most consistent conservatives among William Buckley's Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board was Senator John Tower of Texas. Now, also on the Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board was Ronald Reagan and Robert Morris, the attorney, and Charles Willoughby from Hitler's Kriegs Academy, who became chief of intelligence for Douglas MacArthur. So we're not talking about a bunch of wimps now. We're talking about John Tower of Texas. And I wrote, if there's anything he wouldn't want in his backyard, it was a defector from Russia and his allegedly communist wife from Minsk. Yet 2 years after joining the Young Americans for Freedom in 1962 on the board with Ronald Reagan, Tower passed all waivers in order for Marina Oswald to get to the United States as soon as possible. Without his permission, the trip might never have been taken. Many wives from the USSR are not that lucky. And in that time period, that's when Daniloff was in Moscow, when they were ready to come home, and they had to go to the embassy. And he's from the UPI, and here's a defector coming home, so you may want to know something that's going on. I wrote March 22nd, 1962, Senator Tower cooperated. The sanctions imposed on immigration and nationality are hereby waived in behalf of Mrs. Oswald. The file check on Marina by FBI, CIA, Department of Secret Service, and the Division of Biographical Intelligence and Passport Office cleared her 100%. This is volume 24, page 296 of the Warren Commission hearings. George DeMohrenschildt testified in volume 9, page 228 and 229, that Marina Oswald's father was a czarist officer of some kind. I don't remember whether it was the Navy or the Army. And again, the czarist officer has a connection to the Daniloff family. Papa, Grandpa, Great-Grandpa, the whole gang. Her real father was never identified in 26,000 pages of the Warren Commission hearings by any name or testimony. Between 1948 and 1950, over 200 Belarusian Nazis from the Ukraine and their families were brought to New Jersey. Both George DeMohrenschildt and Marina came from Minsk as part of the Belarusian area. The Galen Nazi emigres were useful to every part of the Kennedy assassination and to the cover-up. Then the next section I wrote about was the Argentine connections, and I mentioned those earlier last week, just a week ago, because of the Daniloffs having in common the Tsar's background, the proximity to Moscow and the intelligence community, journalists working with the State Department and CIA, working with Lee and Marina Oswald before and after the assassination, working with her after. And I mentioned the Argentine connection of the Warren Report that wasn't published until September 64, yet as early as June 1964, an avowed anti-communist Isaac Don Levine, an arch-enemy of communism, an expert on the Soviet mind, was arranging for the Warren Commission to take the daughters of Alexander Zeiger from Minsk radio factory to Argentina. And Oswald told a journalist, a CIA person working for the State Department, he would soon be in that radio factory. And I wrote, what is that about? When the Oswalds left Russia, they smuggled out a message from relatives of the Zeigers in the United States. They wanted their daughters out of Russia. The daughters claimed they were born in Argentina. They could claim Argentine citizenship, and Isaac Levine was suggesting that the CIA get them out of Russia, and this was from memorandum from David Slauson, May 23, 1964, Warren Commission memorandum, and I mentioned Slauson's notations about the circumstances of a flag being put on Oswald's return papers, but it wasn't there, and all the notifications that he's coming back were not there. And a few members of the commission picked up some of these little tidbits, but they never pursued them any further. And so then I went into, in the same article, Treason for My Daily Bread, and the connections of Argentine and Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi financial planning for the resurgence of the Fourth Reich if the Third failed. He replaced Rudolf Hess' position as second under Adolf Hitler. And in 1971, a French paper referred to Martin Bormann as being behind the Kennedy murders. This was published August 1971, and it listed an international band of killers located in Texas. They carried out 2 assassinations at the German command. This is out of the London Guardian. They said Bormann was linked to the Kennedy murder by way of a book, Treason for My Daily Bread, by Nikolai Lebedev. Now, as of this date, I don't know any other Kennedy researcher who's written a book, who's even referred to Treason for My Daily Bread, to the relationship of Martin Bormann in Paraguay and Argentina, to his connection to people who murdered John Kennedy. These allegations fit in with Paris Lamone's book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, and the Torbett document, The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. And you can see why Nicholas Daniloff would, in 1977, try to stop the House Rules Committee by using a gray matter, a CIA matter of a fictitious name with UPI, just to try and slander the committee. We don't know what they did behind their back, because certainly putting G. Robert Blakey in, working with the CIA, assured that they would never get into any of these areas. And I was writing, referring to this book and writing about the relationship of Otto Skorzeny, working with the CIA, and Reinhard Gehlen, and Martin Bormann, and the funds that were put in Evita Perón's banks that would be shared after 1952. Now, did Nicholas Daniloff family get any of this money? They were in Argentina, avowed anti-communist. They moved up to New Hampshire, sent him to Harvard, and then Oxford, and then to Switzerland. And lo and behold, he's unleashed, like I say, to go do the things he's going to do in Russia, then come back to Russia later, where he becomes the cause célèbre for this big scandal where he's picked up by the Russians just before he's ready to come home to the United States and charged with being a spy. And then the State Department and the press and the President of the United States say, send him home or else this will endanger our relationships. We can't have a summit with you next year. If you keep Daniloff, there's no summit. And then lo and behold, they say, okay, we'll meet in 2 weeks or a week. Yeah, we'll get together. How important was all this? And G. Robert Blakey kept the lid on all of the connections of Argentine, of the Warren Commission, of the Nazi connections, of the Solidarists, of the White Russians, and also the Bunge Corporation from Argentina was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. I won't go into details, you can read that, but there were many Argentine connections to the murder of John Kennedy. And of course, the shtick of the John Kennedy murder, the press, the CIA use of the press, was to say that because Lee Harvey Oswald had a Russian wife and been in the Soviet Union, he was a communist. And the whole slant of using this woman who was brought back to this Dallas-Fort Worth area, who worked with the Tolstoy Foundation, the Greek Orthodox Church, the whole thing about using her was to use the media to influence opinions around the world and the United States that the Russians were involved in a conspiracy. Now, this intent of the CIA and news media backfired on the very people who planned what they were doing. Sometimes they're just too clever for their own good. And what happened was, by immediately saying Oswald did it alone, as Dan Rather was saying at the radio station, November 24th, the same line out of ABC, NBC, CBS, Oswald did it alone. They opened and closed the case in 2 days and then slammed away that Oswald was a Marxist. Oswald had a Russian wife. He went to Russia. And it was the symphony of the media that orchestrated this thing that demanded a Warren Commission be formed, or a commission be formed, to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. If they had just let Oswald been killed and not say he did it, and had a quiet Texas investigation and didn't close it within 2 hours of when John Kennedy was murdered, putting Oswald in the jail in that evening, having press conferences, he's the one, he's the only one, and J. Edgar Hoover saying he's the one, he's the only one. This went all over the world, and that is what forced the commission to be formed. Now, the media responded too heavily to Nicholas Daniloff. They know he knows too much. They know what he's done in the State Department, the Defense Department, the White House. They were ready to get him home. He had served his time with the U.S. News and World Report, his anti-Russian material. I have to go back now and read some of those stuff. I never took or read that paper. It's worse than Time and Newsweek, if you can believe it. So now I have to go to the library and look up the years when Daniloff was writing for them, these past years from 1981 to 86, to see the lines of what he was writing and what his name was attached to. And we have to do our homework and find the book that he did on the space program. Because in this case, when Daniloff was picked up, instead of quietly saying, well, okay, have a trial, what'd you find on him? The mistake that Mrs. Daniloff made and Nicholas Daniloff made was some kind of arrangement where they probably thought they'd blast the Future Summit, just as Gary Powers was caught as a spy, and then he'd get off on minor charges after all of this brahoo. But what happened was they got so much news media in it, starting with the New York Times and Washington Post and then all the editorial writers, that it actually forced the immediate summit that was never planned by Ronald Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev. Now, what they discussed there in terms of arms and missiles and nuclear testing isn't important, except the fact that they were forced to get together and say a few other things, I am sure, in the interim, when they met privately. And they said no press allowed. So the press of the world took the advantage of 3 days of silence to interview every single person who's anti-Russian. You heard Zbigniew Brzezinski on the air, and Jean Kirkpatrick, and Michael Ledeen, and Henry Kissinger, and all the people from the Georgetown Center of Strategic Studies, and all the violent anti-communists used this chance of Daniloff's arrest and release to have 3 days of bad-mouthing that went on continuously, criticizing Mrs. Gorbachev for attending, and Nancy Reagan didn't attend. And I want to go into some of those articles and the way the news media covered those events. Now, September the 11th, 1986, San Jose Mercury had an article, An Earlier Brush with the Secret Police. This was written by Ruth Daniloff. 2 years ago, in 1984, Soviet microbiologist David Goldfarb was ready to emigrate to Israel. And on his way, he gave Nicholas Daniloff a book. That's like Daniloff giving a book to Misha. I don't know why when you leave you have to hand people books. They can get the books all the time they want. I don't know why as a farewell they have to give them each other a book. On leaving, Daniloff was photographed by the KGB. The KGB took Dr. Goldfarb to Lubyanka prison and confronted him with his picture of Daniloff. So they've been watching him for a long, long time with his background. Men were sent to search Goldfarb's apartment, Dr. Goldfarb's apartment, where they found some biological strains, and they accused him of wanting to smuggle them out of the Soviet Union with Nicholas Daniloff's help. Now, what in the heck they were doing with these, I don't know. Incidentally, I want to thank Andy for giving me this article. I take the San Jose Mercury, but I didn't see this article. It wasn't in my edition, and I want to thank him for that. There's some great researchers out there who provide David Emery and me with the very interesting little pieces that we miss and don't see that make the total picture come together a lot better. The article goes on, there were a lot of protests from Western scientists, and the case was dropped. Nicky Daniloff gets everyone behind him when these stories come up, and the Soviet Union so far had backed down. While this was going on, the KGB repeatedly suggested to Goldfarb they would drop his case if they would help him. If he would help them, they would let him leave the Soviet Union if he would ask Daniloff to take a package out of the country. Goldfarb said, "I'm an old, one-legged Jew. I don't have much time to live. Whether I go to Israel or not does not make a difference." And Ruth Daniloff wrote, "We would walk our dog out of earshot of microphones 3 months before getting ready to leave Moscow." Now, here's an interesting part of this story, because Nick was going to have a spy charge thrown at him. 3 months before they're leaving, they walk and talk where they're not bugged, because he's going to be charged as a spy before he leaves. She says Nick's weekend visits with the old man Goldfarb were almost sacred. He intended to see Goldfarb in the hospital the very Saturday that Daniloff was arrested by the KGB. On Nick's last visit, Goldfarb said, "Don't worry, I'll be out before you leave." Goldfarb's son, Alexander, who lives in New York City, said after Daniloff visited him, his treatment was better and top Soviet specialists came in to take care of his medical conditions. Now, the issue isn't about whether or not Mr. Goldfarb is going to be allowed to leave. He was arrested because of his contacts to Daniloff, but what were the biological strains that he was making in his apartment, this old, sick, one-legged man, to take to Israel? And of course these emigres say their life ambition is to go to Israel, and they won't let us to be with these other Jews. But as you see, Alexander Goldfarb lives in New York City and not Israel, and after they're left out of the Soviet Union, they usually go through Vienna, and they're directly recruited for spies against the Soviet Union. So Ruth Daniloff is revealing something September the 11th, when she said they knew 3 months earlier that he was going to be arrested. Now, if they knew 3 months earlier through June, July, and August, then why in the world would he meet Misha in a park and give him maps of Afghanistan if he knew it? And remember, it was Mr. Taubman from the New York Times that went to her apartment and said a reporter has been arrested, and Nicholas Daniloff hadn't even been in touch with the American embassy, and neither had the Soviet Union. And how did they know that this man, a journalist, was going to be arrested, and how did he know from the New York Times to be at the Daniloff apartment? So was this a plan, and it's been suggested in some newspaper articles, like the Gary Powers, to blow up the future summit? As I say, it boomeranged, and they got a mini-summit and a date for the other summit behind, so Gorbachev got everything he wanted, and Ronald Reagan will look wimpy to the far right and may even get a bullet for his efforts. But Mrs. Daniloff was revealing that for 3 months they knew that he was going to be arrested, and yet, for some idiotic reason, he meets somebody and says on the telephone, and she says all their lines are bugged, "We'll meet you where we met before," which was a year ago, and pictures were taken at that bridge before of other spies exchanging information. Now, September the 2nd, 1986, there was an article in the Washington Post, and Reagan was still vacationing in Santa Barbara. The headline says, "Aides said Soviets plan to put Daniloff on trial." And this article doesn't rule out the possibility of an exchange of Daniloff for the alleged Russian spy, Mr. Gennady Zakharov. But a few days later they said, no, we are not going to exchange. He is a spy, and we're going to try him as a spy. The USSR said if Daniloff broke the law, and it's a classic example of espionage, we will try him. The last trial was the American Francis Gary Power, and it involved the U-2, which broke up a possible summit meeting at that time between President Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev, and many articles have noticed the similarity of the countries allegedly planning a summit, and then this comes along and would interfere with the summit. And the Soviet foreign minister said the decision for the trial will be in a few days. The matter of importance is that his actions went beyond his usual journalistic activity. And I'm sure they had a lot on him. The editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report said this is phony, this is an affront to journalism, this is crude connivance. And his wife, Ruth Daniloff, says it's a farce, it's a surrealistic nightmare, they planted evidence on someone, and it is a crude job. Just keep in mind his background and their adjectives and put them next to each other. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll come back to this as part 2 of the Daniloff series, and I hope I can cover a lot more material in this remaining half hour. Get it done this evening, but I won't be able to. It's just going too fast. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second part of World Watchers, program number 776, and the final half hour on Nicholas Daniloff. I do want to do more next week, but I wanted to do these 2 weeks in succession. It's very important to understand him, and as I say, the response of the administration, of the news media, of the writers in the newspapers, the editorials and so forth, and the government officials, the intense response they have when a man was arrested just for a very few days, 9 or 10 days, the hysteria, and then put that side by side with the background that I shared with you on Daniloff and see why they were hysterical. That's why I did the background first, to give you a little bit of a view of why they were hysterical. September the 6th, Washington Post, headline, Schultz voices outrage with Soviets over reporter. He bars a direct swap of the spies. American press corps appealed for the correspondence release. These are their exact words. They demanded, they were outraged, they appealed. Quotes, Daniloff's arrest impeded the journalists from doing their work and thus violated the Helsinki Accords. This was the charge. The actions against Daniloff are an attempt to intimidate every member of the media community in Moscow. Now keep in mind how many people in the media community, I'm afraid to ask, have that background of Daniloff, with great-grandpa trying to kill a czar, with grandpa in the czar's intelligence, living in Paris even as a child, during the Hitler days in Paris, and then moving to Argentina under Juan Perón, and going to Harvard and 4 years, and then to Oxford, and then being sent back to Russia in 1961, the whole area of Leon Marina Oswald and Gary Powers' trial, and then going back to the Soviet Union in 1981, and trying to sabotage in goodness knows how many ways, but one we know, a typical gray area CIA, the chance for the Rules Committee vote in the in Congress, the House of Representatives, to open up the John Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassination, and both the Martin Luther King assassination and the JFK assassination involved Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, who was a journalist in Moscow, who covered as a writer and author, who worked for the United States intelligence and for the State Department. She was involved with them, with the assassinations, rather, she and her husband, of the Martin Luther King and John Kennedy, covering it up. She worked with with Lee Oswald in Moscow, and was close to Marina as soon as Oswald was killed. Took her to Sedona, Arizona for a little bitty brainwashing, and then wrote a book about them. And disguised, as I say, as a journalist in Moscow, at the same place where Daniloff is going to be, with the same kinds of feelings, violently anti-Russian. To say in the news media that Daniloff's arrest impeded all journalists from doing their work is, again, a disinformation quoted by George Shultz, blasting the Soviet Union at Harvard University, and not mentioning, I don't believe in what I read, that Nicholas Daniloff graduated from there, along with the ilk of Priscilla Johnson and Henry Kissinger, and many of the other anti-communists at Harvard University, but suggesting that arrest impeded all journalists, or that every member of the media in Moscow is in danger because Daniloff was arrested when he was working with space people, with the space program, with the biological weapons, with Tsarist white Russians, with refuseniks who want to get out of there, whose sympathies are with them. They put him in a ball of wax as all the others, but they don't have the honesty to tell you his background. They just tell you that if you take Daniloff, then no journalist is safe, which is another disinformation lie occurring right now and at Harvard University celebrating their 350th anniversary. George Shultz used the speech to blast the Soviet Union and talk about Nicholas Daniloff. The New York Times, September the 6th, 1986, is titled, Shultz Demands the Soviet Free the U.S. Journalist. The other article from the Washington Post was Shultz voices outrage with the Soviets. These are same articles the same day from different newspapers using different words, and he tells the public to be aware of this crisis and warns that Daniloff could soon begin to jeopardize Soviet-American relations. As again, this is only on the 6th of September. He's only been arrested August the 30th, and these adjectives are so important. The Secretary of State has an outrage. The Secretary of State demands. The U.S.-USA relations are in danger. As I say, who is he? It's just been 6 days. Washington Post, September the 7th. Ruth Daniloff's diary, headline, I feel terrified for Nick. She says his cellmate is clearly a plant in the prison there, and that even though he was caught with 2 maps that were marked top secret, it isn't a big deal, and she feels terrified. She feels terrified, and he said if Reagan hadn't gotten him out, he would have been many years in the Soviet Union. They all knew he was guilty. They knew the things that he had done in the past that none of us know, and things that he was doing at the time. And it depended upon the President of the United States to jump in with the Secretary of State and every figure of speech, known and well-known and some unknown editorial writers, and the surprising, in quotes, liberal left pounding on this, unanimous in the importance of Daniloff. And again, at the time of the William Colby hearings in Representative Pike's congressional hearings, there were 400 news people at the time working for the CIA. And Daniloff, in those earlier periods, when he went from 1961 and then working up until 75, that was supposed to stop. But again, in 1977, he's used by the UPI and quoted by Mark Lane. Now, September the 8th, Washington Post. Daniloff is indicted as a spy by the Soviets. And Russia warned the United States there are serious implications for the United States. The Soviet Union said, we're going to indict him, we have, and there are serious implications. And it's that turning point, September the 8th, where there is absolute hysteria about what is going on with Daniloff. We've got to get him out. It got so bad that by September the 18th or 19th, Mr. Shevardnadze was called to the White House, and I'll get to that, I hope so, in this half hour. The second part of this article, Washington Post, September the 8th, Larry Speaks was quoted, the journalist is innocent. No trade possible, he's innocent. And then a quotation of parts of a letter sent by Ronald Reagan. Last week, a personal letter was sent to Gorbachev from Ronald Reagan. Free Daniloff, he's not a spy. The Secretary of State, the President of the United States, and his spokesperson, Larry Speaks. The journalist is innocent, one says. The other says he's not a spy. And the Soviets get a letter from Ronald Reagan a week earlier, and 7 days later they say he's indicted as a spy, which means we don't care what you think, Ronald Reagan. We don't care what you think, George Shultz or Larry Speaks. He has been indicted, and the letter from the president doesn't mean a thing. That was a week before that Ronald Reagan wrote, and they indicted him. Soviet Gerasimov, I don't know if I pronounced this right, charged that Daniloff doesn't deny the things he got in this envelope that were marked secret. Daniloff could stand a 6 months investigation, they said, and that he went to his meetings on his own will. He made this step, he has to take the consequences, and he hadn't said if there was money that he exchanged for the maps that he got. September the 8th, New York Times, and I quoted 2 Washington Post stories, one from the 7th and one from the 8th. titled headlines, Impact of Case Called Serious by the White House. It gets very serious because Ronald Reagan wrote immediately to Gorbachev and said, let him out, he's not a spy. And 7 days later, they say, we indicted him. So now it's really serious. Impact of Case Called Serious. Reagan is described as concerned on Daniloff. Now, Reagan, remember, in 1960 was put on the board of Young Americans for Freedom. Those very people were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. They were involved with CIA activities that was set up by William Buckley and Douglas Caddy, whose offices were used for the Watergate payments, and the former CIA, James McCourtney, Howard Hunt, and the rest that were all CIA that they called former CIA there. And then the White House got very concerned because what if he is tried as a spy? He can't be that innocent if they're so concerned. It's impossible. So then the article goes on, Schultz and Eduard Shevardnadze, the Soviet minister, will meet September the 19th and 20th to set a date for the meeting summit in the United States of Mr. Gorbachev. So there was no intention, September the 8th, to put Mr. Shevardnadze into the White House, where he was pressured by Ronald Reagan, and as a consequence, Gorbachev sent a letter and said, well, let's get off to Iceland and talk about this thing. The adjectives are terrified, serious, concerned, extremely distressed, and psychological pressure that is being put on Daniloff, and I'm sure on a lot of other people, including the President of the United States, the State Department, and the CIA. Now, this one article from the New York Times continues. This is September the 8th. Jailed American charged in Soviet as being a spy. The Washington Post had that title too, and formal accusation made. The move against the correspondent was made despite a letter from Reagan on his innocence, and that was in the headlines, those big letters by Felicity Behringer. So they announced right there, if you don't have to have it translated, as I did with the earlier article, that the USSR believes that Reagan is lying. And what would the Soviet Union have to gain by creating a false story of making Daniloff a lie and aggravating the United States, who are always trying to prove them an evil empire? Daniloff was charged with espionage. The actions were taken at a time when the Soviet Union wanted to arrange a summit conference, and this is pointed out in the article. And then there's a quotation of the foreign minister from the Soviet Union. If you think he's innocent, you can learn pretty well soon. There is going to be a trial. You can learn pretty soon, rather. There's going to be a trial. And he said this particular envelope was not the only thing we have against Daniloff. Not the envelope he got from Misha with the maps marked top secret. We've had other problems with Daniloff before. And they referred to Professor Frederick Barghorn, Barghorn from Yale, who was arrested and spying in the Soviet Union. A man had put papers in his hand. They were rolled up. He was seized by the security and charged with having classified information. And his arrest came 3 days, came after 3 Russians and American were arrested in the United States, and they were traded and released. That release was arranged November 16th after John Kennedy declared the Russian spy from Yale to be innocent. And then this article concludes from the New York Times, if they go ahead and try and sentence him, it's a personal insult to Ronald Reagan. Now, considering Ronald Reagan's role in the Kennedy assassination, his mentor, Patrick Frawley, employed Mr. Butler in New Orleans, who made a record with Oswald Ed Butler, saying, I am a Marxist, the cover for influencing the media to switch it to a communist Cold War lying story that Mr. Khrushchev knew at the time wasn't true. Oswald wasn't a Marxist in the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan would not extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley to Jim Garrison's trial, and he worked closely with the very people involved in the murder of John Kennedy and the cover-up of John Kennedy. So the way that this is twisted, and the news is very important, the way it's twisted around, it's the way they say if you arrest Nicholas Daniloff for being a spy, then no other newspaper reporter in Moscow is ever safe, which is a lie. Now they're saying if you go ahead and sentence him, and the president told you not to, that he's not a spy, then you are personally insulting Ronald Reagan. And how bad can that be for the Soviet Union when he's such a popular president, to personally insult him? Well, obviously, Mr. Gorbachev wasn't worried about insulting Ronald Reagan. When you consider the insults that they have taken over and over again. And the New York Times article concluded, Western journalists are in a furor over Daniloff case. USSR said he has been made a hero of the day by the Western propaganda, and they were saying in the newspapers in Russia, Izvestia and other papers, that they made a hero out of him, which they wanted to do. Me think thou protest too much. The quotation, the Soviet Union was watching a massive symphony orchestrated about the innocence of Daniloff from everybody who has a fountain pen and can write, or a typewriter, or a computer. And he became a total hero in the United States that everybody wanted to free. U.S. News and World Report were selling sweatshirts, free Nicholas Daniloff. And the Soviet Union said that Daniloff was made to appear as naive, innocent victim of the tyranny of Soviet Russia and their authorities, and they make him appear as if he were a pawn in their political game of chess. That diabolical thing, again, of I am an innocent man. Interestingly enough, remember that it was Mrs. Daniloff who said that 3 months earlier they knew there was going to be an arrest. But that was synchronized with the news media and carried out, and as I say, it boomeranged in many ways. Now, another article from September the 8th, continuing rather the New York Times, a large heading, a long ordeal forecast for reporter. Oh, this is a different story, September the 8th, New York Times, by Harold J. Bormann. And this, again, is one of these slanted articles out of Harvard by a Harvard law professor. He was there from 1948. The CIA was formed in 1947 until 1985, last year. And he now teaches at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, an interesting place to be. And he was cited in the New York Times. Nicholas Daniloff can face a long ordeal if the United States and USSR do not make political arrangements to free him. In other words, get off your butt, because if you don't do something, it's going to be late. He's definitely going to be locked in the clink for a long time. Now the question, what is the hurry to get him out, that they used all of these ploys to say it's essential that we get him out, it's important that we get him out. And then there's another question that comes up again with the chronology that I gave last week on the chronology of Nicholas Daniloff. Where was he from 1973 to 1981? These eager beaver reporters find certain dates that they can locate him, but it doesn't say who he worked for in that time period. Now, he worked for UPI or with them or around them, obviously, in January of 1977 when this letter was sent, or article by UPI, that the people wanting to open up the investigation of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King were threatening Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, which didn't happen, in fact, and was traced to Daniloff on the very day they're going to vote whether the Rules Committee can investigate these murders. So this was a byline of the UPI. But where else was he? And if we know where he was from 1973 until 1981, it would give an important part of why they were so hysterical. Because part of this time period I mentioned, he worked with the State Department, the White House, and the Defense Department, and he touched all bases. And his former classmate from Oxford was in charge of emigres from the Soviet Union, and we had a lot of them and a lot of propaganda and press coverage through these years about the emigres wanting to come here. Now, Harold Bormann, who was at Harvard teaching law, said he made fun of the Soviet system of law, and he wrote a book called Soviet Criminal Law and Procedures. And quoted in the New York Times are some remarks of his. He said, the USSR makes their own laws, and they want them obeyed. They're eager to give their system legitimacy in the eyes of their own people and in the eyes of the world, even though the law is abused when important political considerations come to the fore. Now, he's an expert on Soviet law from Harvard, 1948 to 1985, that whole time span of the anti-Soviet departments there. But in a book written by Seymour Melman about Nazi Germany, he went into great lengths on how law was perverted from 1922 until Hitler was elected in 1933. Then there were no more laws. And how they managed to make the courts appear to be working and legitimate, where guilty people and involving political assassinations and liberals and the left and changing the fabric of Germany from the Weimar Republic into Hitler's fascist Third Reich, the guilty, the assassins and the people involved in murders, were out, and the innocent were locked up, and one of their largest problems was perverting the court. Now, the minute the war was over, we hired Reinhard Gehlen, who, with his family, his brother and families, worked in the process of covert action for Adolf Hitler that was part of this operation of assassination and cover-up. And we took these jurists and these lawyers and made them our co-workers and worked with them forming our intelligence community and with Reinhard Gehlen. And we put Gehlen back over there in charge of the intelligence, the BND. And there never was a critique or a criticism of the legal establishment that worked with the United States from those early days on to the present day, and international legal meetings and so forth. So there's no objection to persons in the OSS, CIA, the American Bar Association, such as Leon Jaworski, who was president of the American Bar Association, being an attorney advisor to the Warren Commission and outright lying on the murder of John Kennedy and naming a false Patsy Lee Oswald when the connections were so much bigger. The inconsistency of people like Harold Berman looking the other way while we have pathological liars in the legal profession, and then accusing the Soviet Union, and I don't want you to think I think the Soviet Union's perfect, but it is nauseating to see the establishment people cited when crises come out like this, such as bad-mouthing what they do in Russia when we accept it. Mr. Pinochet has no great legal system, nor does the president in South Korea or Mr. Zia in Pakistan, and our allies, the Chang family in Taiwan, you name it. And the military dictatorships we had with Klaus Barbie and his gang in Bolivia, and the military dictatorship that Vernon Walters and the CIA put in Brazil. There were no legal systems there, and there was no legitimacy in the eyes of the people anywhere in the world about the legal systems in the dictatorships, such as the Savak ran for the Shah of Iran after the CIA put him in, and I could cite 44 countries going this way. So when Daniloff is arrested, this professor from law, who's the expert on Soviet Union, tells you that he will naturally be convicted because they will forge the evidence, and that's the way they work. Nobody's innocent in Russia because they write their own laws. Just forgetting the whole background of Daniloff and all the bases he touched. God forbid there was some reason for the Russians to believe and stand up to the fact that he was a spy, and that's what they chose to do. Now, in the same article, Professor Leon Lipson from Yale University, is quoted, he's an expert on the Soviet legal system. He said, if the Soviet Union continues to make the advances in civil liberties and legal procedures it made since the 1940s and 50s, we can look forward to the day, perhaps in 25 years, when it reaches the level of Franco Spain. Now, again, the Vatican and Germany and the United States liked Franco Spain. They supported him. Charles Willoughby, the head of intelligence for Douglas McCarthy, the real Wiedenbach, his name is, from Germany, he got Congress to give Franco over $35 million, and we gave him many, many millions more than that. We never asked for trials and juries in Franco Spain. He was an ally of ours. We appreciated his relationship, just as Marcos of the Philippines, and the legal system there. You could compare the dictatorships that we have supported and put into power and compare them to the Soviet system. And if you're going to level these charges and use these experts from Yale and Harvard who make themselves experts, then the public has to be reminded of the outright hypocrisy of these people pulling this. Every time there's a crisis, they come out of the woodwork with their pat answers, and every time they do that, it gets us psychologically ready to go to war. Now, September 8th, the New York Times had an article by Anthony Lewis, What Gorbachev Risks. He says the stakes are high in the Daniloff affair. Gorbachev sent many signals, but he's ready to deal. First, he says he's ready to deal, and then he's ready to have the trial. He can't be open. He assumed the leadership of the Soviet Union that he would be open. He blew that hollow claim with the Chernobyl disaster. And keep in mind Daniloff's close relationships to the space industry and I presume, the astronauts and scientists in Russia. He says, how can we deal with a system that resorts to transparent inventions as planted evidence as spying? Anthony Lewis, Given the background of Daniloff that I've shared with you last week and this week, these are transparent inventions and planted evidence. He said if Daniloff charges are pressed, no American would go to a summit conference. If you charge Daniloff, what if something came out at the trial? What if the Soviet Union knows about any possible links to Chernobyl? What do they know about him? When Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald were there, Anthony Lewis is saying if the Soviet Union pressed charges, no one should go to a summit conference. You shouldn't talk about arms reduction, Star Wars, atomic testing. The most important thing, the litmus paper, is Daniloff. We've got to get him home. Now, that's a lot of nervousness. That's a lot of anxiety. The New York Times the next day had a story, Soviet indicates Daniloff faces wider charges. Now, that makes it worse because they're past those maps and so forth. And the article says the USSR will link Daniloff to an American diplomat expelled last year. I mentioned him, Paul Stambaugh, and then it went in about Daniloff's contacts with Misha. He first met in 1982, and then he met a year later, and on the telephone, as I say, they agreed to meet at a certain place. And this article about further charges said Daniloff allegedly requested military information relating to Afghanistan, photographs of Soviet military equipment, names and addresses of soldiers who fought in Afghanistan for the Soviets, the location of military units prepared for action in Afghanistan. Now, when Lee Harvey Oswald returned from the Soviet Union with his wife, June 1962, they went to Fort Worth, and before they could barely unpack their few meager belongings, and allegedly had no money and kept their baby named June in the drawer of a bureau, opened, of course, not closed, he went to a secretary named Pauline Bates, and he dictated about Soviet troop movements and tanks and observances from airplanes from ground level and so forth, things that he was able to see going out to the country on the weekends, working at the Minsk radio factory run by Mr. Zeiger from Argentina, who is closely affiliated with our Central Intelligence Agency. This very poor Lee Harvey Oswald goes to the American Embassy in Moscow, and they give him money for him and his wife to come home, and he did indeed keep his citizenship. All that stuff about giving the Soviet Union secrets of the Marines was a bunch of BS, and he was privy to secrets enough to go to a secretary, and there were affidavits of Pauline Bates when the Warren Commission hearings were taken. The first plans were for the Texas courts to investigate the murder of Kennedy, or there would be no Pauline Bates that we know about. The only reason we know about these people, again, is that the news media synchronized, blamed the Soviet Union and Russia and Fidel Castro for the murder of Kennedy. Nobody around the world believed it, so Lyndon Johnson had to form a commission upon which he put Alan Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency, former director fired by John Kennedy, and John J. McCloy, who had been in Paris for 10 years before World War II broke out, represented the law interests of I.G. Farben, worked for and on the board of Chase Manhattan Bank, and then released the top Nazis out of Germany in a very short time after the Nuremberg trial so that they could all meet again in Argentina and Peru and Brazil and Bolivia and Paraguay and so forth and begin their resurgence of the Fourth Reich. Now, another article, December the 9th, Moscow levels new charges, and then it goes on, the Soviet government has extended the hard line even further. The New York Times had one story, Daniloff faces wider charges. The Washington Times is the Reverend Moon paper. The charges go even further. The new charges will carry a penalty of 15 years, sometimes life. It is not clear if the Daniloff case will lead to a cancellation of proposed summit later this year. That was written September the 9th. Little did they know that by October, Gorbachev would be meeting with Ronald Reagan because all of the junk they were writing forced a meeting, and Daniloff was the numero uno issue, and in strategic places at the right time made it very impossible that he could stand trial. And also, if there was a connection between Reagan's friends and Young Americans for Freedom and the Moscow clink, which those relationships can be tied together, Reagan would want him home, and Daniloff was not somebody to be kept in the Soviet Union. Ruth Daniloff said in the Washington Times, It's just for domestic consumption, the new charges. While this case is being decided, she said, at a much higher level. Now, she knows about that. She was at Oxford when he was there in England and accompanied him to the Soviet Union 2 times. And then she reveals parts of herself in the articles that she has published. I wish I had more time just to talk about Ruth Daniloff, because unknowingly she lets things out, such as saying we knew for 3 months that he was going to be arrested by the KGB. And then she says that these charges are something that involve a much higher level, and you can believe they do. And the only thing that comes to my mind that would be so important, in addition to where he was before in Russia, was his link to the Soviet space program and the catastrophe at Chernobyl that I believed, as I say, was a sabotage to put them in the position they're in, which is defensive ever since. There was a call to Daniloff, she said, and quote in the newspaper, from this Misha who said, "I am Prince, let's meet at the usual place at 11 o'clock under the Iron Bridge." And, of course, knowing that for 3 months you're going to be arrested, it's interesting that you would answer to somebody that you haven't seen for a year. And then Daniloff has handed a map of Afghanistan, marked secret, and, as I say, pictures of military hardware and so forth. Now, the hysteria of the newspaper, I don't have time to go through some of the top articles. I have about 20 titles here. Just the titles alone are very, very important to show the importance of Daniloff. But this hour is over again, and probably next week I'll do part 3, at least a half hour, on Nicholas Daniloff, and then get back to some of the other news that has been taking place or has taken place the last 2 weeks, and get back to that. But I do want to continue on this man because I think he's more important than any of us know, but the powers that be know that fact and make it quite clear. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. The program is called World Watchers, and I'll be back with you next week.